Don't let her near him. He will put her on the ground. The words came out flat, not as a warning, more like a statement of fact from a man who had already decided how the next 5 minutes would go. Sergeant First Class Dillon Hark stood in the middle of the intake bay at Ridgemont Animal Rehabilitation Center, one hand wrapped tight around the leash of a Belgian Malinois named Boone. The other arm crossed over his chest, like he was daring someone to disagree with him. He was built like a man who had spent 20 years making sure no one ever did. 6'2", broad through the shoulders, jaw set in that particular way military men get when they've been obeyed for so long that the idea of pushback genuinely surprises them. Boone stood at his side, perfectly still, which was the problem. 100-pound Malinois should not be that still at a rehabilitation intake. He should be sniffing, shifting weight, doing the 1,000 small restless things that dogs do when they're processing a new environment. Instead, Boone stood with his head low, ears flat, eyes tracking the room in slow, cautious sweeps. His ribs moved with each breath. That was the only proof he was alive. Faye Dolan noticed the ribs first. She noticed because that's what she did. She noticed things that other people explained away. 6 years working animal rehab, 2 of them as lead behavioral tech at Ridgemont, and she had developed a particular sensitivity to the gap between what a handler said about their animal and what the animal's body was actually reporting. Boone's body was reporting something that had nothing to do with aggression. She set her clipboard down on the intake counter and took 1 step toward them. "Ma'am." Hark's voice landed like a hand on her chest, stopping her without touching her. "I said don't." The intake coordinator, a soft-spoken man named Pete, cleared his throat from behind his desk. "Sir, Ms. Dolan is our lead behavioral assessor. She needs to— I know what she needs to do." Hark didn't look at Pete. He was still watching Faye. "She can do it from there." Faye held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked down at Boone. The dog hadn't moved, but his eyes had found her. Not in the way an aggressive dog finds a threat. She'd seen that enough times to know the difference. This was something else. Something slower and more careful, like a question being asked in a language the asker wasn't sure anyone else spoke. "How long has he been off food?" she asked. The question was directed at Hark, but she kept her eyes on Boone when she asked it. Hark's chin lifted slightly. "Who told you that?" "Nobody." She nodded toward the dog. "He's hollow behind his last rib. That takes more than a few missed meals." A muscle ticked in Hark's jaw. "He's been selective." Stress response from the transition. "He was deployed 8 months, came back 6 weeks ago. He'll regulate." "He's not regulating." She said it quietly, without accusation. "His coat's dull, his eyes are sunken at the corners, and he's been holding that exact posture since you walked in. That's not stress from a new environment. That's chronic." The room got very quiet. There were 2 other staff members in the intake bay, a vet tech named Carla and a younger rehab assistant whose name tag read Oliver. Neither of them said anything. Carla had taken a half step back, which Faye understood. Dillon Hark was the kind of man who generated distance without asking for it. "Boone is a decorated military working dog," Hark said. His voice had shifted, lower, slower, the kind of controlled that takes effort. "He has served 3 deployments. He has a bite record that would make your hair stand up. I have been his handler for 4 years. I know this dog." "I'm sure you do," Faye said. "I'm not questioning your service. I'm looking at what's in front of me." She took another step forward, just one. Slow and deliberate, body angled slightly away, no direct eye contact with Boone, all the things that said, "I am not a threat, I am not a challenge, I am just here." "Don't," Hark's voice went sharp. "I'm telling you he will." Boone moved, not toward Faye, not in the lunging, teeth-forward motion that Hark had been predicting. He moved sideways, a half step, the leash going slack in a way Hark clearly hadn't expected, and then he sat down. Not on command, he just sat. And then very slowly, he lowered his nose toward the floor and exhaled. It was such a simple thing. Such a small, quiet thing. A dog sitting down and breathing out. But Faye had seen what it meant. She had seen it enough times in enough intake rooms and shelter runs and backyard evaluations to know that what Boone had just done was surrender. Not to her, not to the room. To whatever he had been holding in his body for the past 6 weeks. Hark was staring at his dog like he didn't recognize him. "He doesn't do that," he said. His voice had lost its armor. "He doesn't. That's not something he does." Faye crouched down. Not all the way, not the kind of crouch that invites a dog over, just enough to bring herself down below his eye level. She kept her hands in her lap and her eyes on the middle distance. "I know," she said softly. To the dog, not to Hark. Boone raised his head. What happened next, Faye would not be able to explain in any clinical language that would satisfy a report. She had tried before, tried to describe the moment in her documentation, the moment when a dog that has been braceless against the world, for so long it has forgotten what unbraced feels like, finally just decides to try. She could never find words that didn't sound either overly scientific or embarrassingly sentimental, so she had stopped trying to document it and just let herself receive it. Boone stood up, crossed the 3 feet of intake floor between them, and put his head in her lap. The sound Dillon Hark made was not a word. It was something that started in his chest and didn't quite make it out. Something that belonged to a person who had been running on competence and control for so long that an unexpected softness caught him completely off guard. Carla turned toward the window. Oliver found something to look at on the supply cart. Faye put one hand on the back of Boone's neck, very gently, and felt the dog exhale again. The intake assessment took 2 hours. Faye ran it methodically, the way she always did. Behavioral observations, physical markers, response testing, touch tolerance across 17 different points on the body. She documented everything on the intake form in her small, precise handwriting, and she let Boone set the pace for all of it, which he did with a patience that surprised even her given how he had come in. Hark stayed. She hadn't expected him to. Most handlers dropped their animals at intake and came back for the evaluation summary. But he pulled a chair into the corner of the assessment room and sat in it with his arms on his knees and his eyes on Boone for the entirety of 2 hours, and he didn't interrupt once. When she was done, she sat cross-legged on the padded mat with her clipboard and went through her notes. "He's underweight by approximately 14%, she said. "That's not catastrophic, but it's significant. His left hip has some inflammation that I'm pretty confident is going to show up on imaging as early-stage dysplasia. It's common in working dogs his age, especially with his deployment history. His cortisol behavior markers are elevated, which explains the food refusal. He's not being selective. He's too stressed to eat." Hark's forearms pressed harder into his knees. "They told me he was cleared. Who did?" "The military vet unit that processed him out. Full physical, they said. Said he was fit for civilian rehab placement." Faye looked at him. He wasn't being defensive anymore. He was something different now. A man receiving information that was rearranging something he'd understood as settled. The dysplasia wouldn't necessarily show on a standard clearance physical without imaging, she said. And the cortisol markers, you can't see those. You can only see what they produce. The food refusal, the hypervigilance, the stillness. He said it before she finished. His jaw worked. "I thought he was calm. Post-deployment, I thought he was finally calm. He was always on deployment, he was always moving, always on. I thought the stillness was him settling down." Faye was quiet for a moment. "How long have you had him?" she asked. 4 years. He rubbed a hand over his face. "I put in for him specifically, requested the pairing. He'd had 2 handlers before me, neither one worked out, and they were about to reassign him to training duty. Desk job, basically, for a working dog. I didn't want that for him." He paused. "He's good at his job. He's really good at it." "I know," Faye said. "I can see that. Dogs like Boone, high drive, high red, built to work. When they don't have an outlet for that, when the structure comes out from under them, they don't know what to do with themselves. The stillness isn't peace. It's shutdown." Hark looked at the dog. Boone was lying on the mat beside Faye, his head resting on his front paws, watching Hark with steady, dark eyes. "Is he going to be okay?" Hark asked. It was the first time he had asked a question instead of issued a statement, and the change was stark enough that Faye took a moment before she answered. "Yes," she said. "I think so, with the right plan." She didn't think much more about Sergeant Hark that week. She had 8 other animals in active rehab, 2 trauma case shepherds from a hoarding situation, 2 counties over, a retired search and rescue bloodhound with nerve damage in his rear legs, a border collie with fear aggression so severe that even experienced staff had to run through a protocol before entering his run. Boone went onto her caseload alongside them, and she treated him the way she treated all of them, methodically, patiently, without sentimentality, and without shortcuts. He started eating on day 4. It was such a small thing. She put the bowl down in the corner of his kennel, run the way she had every morning, and on day 4 she came back 20 minutes later and it was half empty. She noted it on his chart and moved on, but she stood outside his run for an extra moment that afternoon, watching him watch her, and she let herself feel it. The small, particular satisfaction of a living thing deciding to keep living. She texted nothing about it to anyone. She had learned early in this work that the celebrations that meant the most were the ones you kept mostly to yourself, because other people didn't understand the specific weight of them. Hark came back on day 6. She wasn't expecting him. Visiting wasn't part of the Ridgemont protocol during the first week. They found that handler presence in the early stages of rehab often reset the animal's tension levels, pulling them back toward whatever dynamics had contributed to the problem in the first place. She had explained this to Hark at intake. He had nodded. She had assumed he understood. He was standing outside the observation window when she came out of the bloodhound's room, still in his uniform, his cap in his hand. "I know," he said before she could speak. "I'm not supposed to be here." "You're not," she agreed. He stopped, looked at the floor, then back up. "I drove here twice this week and turned around in the parking lot. Today I figured I'd at least see if you'd tell me anything." Faye looked at him for a moment. "He ate on Thursday," she said. Hark's shoulders dropped about 2 inches. He let out a breath that seemed like it had been waiting in his lungs for days. "Yeah," he said. "Half a bowl. By Saturday it was the whole thing." He nodded. His hand turned his cap in a slow circle. "Okay," he said. "Okay," he was quiet for a moment. "The hip? We started low-impact conditioning and hydrotherapy. He tolerates the water well, actually. A lot of Malinois don't, but Boone seems to find it regulating. His range of motion is improving." Hark looked at the window. Through it, you could see a section of the interior rehabilitation yard, low obstacles, padded surfaces, a few staff members moving around. Boone wasn't visible from this angle, but Hark looked anyway. "He always liked water," Hark said. "We were in a region that was mostly dust and rock, and whenever we'd hit a water source, a culvert, even a drainage ditch, he'd want to wade in. I always told him no. Contamination risk. He's making up for lost time," Faye said. Hark almost smiled. It was a small, reluctant thing, there and gone in a second. He came back the following week too, and the week after that. He always came during her shift, which she told herself was a coincidence for the first 2 visits, before she stopped telling herself that. He always brought a question, something specific about Boone's progress, his hip, his food intake, his sleep behavior, and she always answered it because the questions were good ones, the questions of a man who had been paying close attention. The conversations started to stretch. One afternoon in the 3rd week, she found herself sitting on the bench outside the observation window with a thermos of coffee that had gone cold, listening to him describe the first time he had worked Boone in the field. A search op, a collapsed building, the dog going into spaces no person could reach, and she realized she had been listening for 20 minutes without checking the time once. She noticed that too. The situation with the military clearance came to a head in week 4. She had put in a formal inquiry with the veterinary unit that had processed Boone's discharge, citing the imaging results that confirmed dysplasia and requesting documentation of his pre-discharge physical. What came back took 11 days and 3 follow-up emails, and when it arrived, it was a form that listed Boone's discharge physical as a visual-only examination, no blood work, no imaging, no joint assessment. She forwarded it to her director, a compact, sharp-eyed woman named Dr. Reyes, who read it twice and then set it face down on her desk. "This is a pattern," Dr. Reyes said. "What do you mean?" "In the last 18 months, we've received 4 military working dogs from the same discharge processing unit, all cleared as fit, all with conditions that should have been caught." She turned the paper face up again. "One had a fully untreated shoulder injury. One had heartworm so advanced it was in his lungs. One," she stopped. "The dogs aren't being cleared, they're being processed. There's a difference." Faye sat with that for a moment. "What do? We document, we report, we build a file." Dr. Reyes looked at her, "And we take care of Boone." Faye took care of Boone. She also spent 3 evenings that week in her kitchen at her small table with her laptop and a cup of tea that also cold, reading through every piece of publicly available information she could find about military working dog discharge protocols, official complaint channels, and the federal oversight processes for animal welfare in government programs. She printed some things out. She made a folder. She didn't tell Hark about any of it, not yet. He came on Thursday, as he had started doing. He brought his own coffee now, which she had noted with a private, inexplicable warmth that she had not examined closely. "Something's wrong," he said, when he saw her face. She had forgotten that he was a man trained to read rooms and faces. She should not have forgotten that, she told him. She watched his expression as she laid it out. The inquiry, the form, the visual-only physical, Dr. Reyes's comment about the pattern. She watched him go through something in real time. Not the controlled stillness he'd walked in with on day one, but something rawer, a kind of slow-burning anger that came from a man who had trusted a system and was now receiving evidence that the system had failed something he loved. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "There were 2 other dogs," he said finally. "Handlers I knew. Their dogs came back with the same cleared paperwork. One of the dogs, Hector, a shepherd, he died 8 months after discharge. Degenerative condition. Handler was told it was unavoidable. Age-related." He paused. He was 6 years old. Faye opened the folder. She slid it across the bench to him. He looked at her before he looked at it. "You already started," he said. "I already started," she confirmed. He looked at the folder for a long moment, and then he picked it up, and something in his posture shifted. Not the military straightness he'd come in with, but something more grounded, more human. Like a man who had been trying to carry something alone and had just been offered help he didn't know how to ask for. The formal complaint took 6 weeks to compile and submit. It named the processing unit, cited the 4 known cases from Ridgemont, and included a narrative of Boone's documented condition on intake set against his discharge clearance paperwork. Hark connected Faye with the 2 other handlers, who added their own documentation. A veterans advocacy organization got involved. A journalist reached out to Dr. Reyes. Faye spoke to the journalist once briefly on the phone. She said what she had seen and what the records showed and nothing more. She was not comfortable with any of it. She was not built for the parts of this that happened in public. She was built for the intake room and the assessment mat and the slow, patient work of helping a broken thing remember how to be okay. But she did it anyway, because Boone had put his head in her lap on day 1, and she had understood what he was asking. The processing unit was suspended from military working dog discharge procedures pending an investigation. The outcome of that investigation and what accountability would actually look like was still unresolved when Boone completed his rehabilitation at Ridgemont. But the machine had been set in motion. Other handlers came forward. Another advocacy group joined. The documentation file Dr. Reyes had started was now 53 pages long and living on a federal ombudsman's desk. On Boone's last official day of rehab, Faye took him through his final behavioral assessment. He passed every marker. His weight was within normal range for his age and build. His hip, while something he would manage carefully for the rest of his life, had responded well to the conditioning protocol. His cortisol markers were down. He was eating full meals. He was sleeping through the night, which Hark reported with a kind of tired gratitude that told her exactly how many nights he himself had been sleeping poorly in the interim. She walked Boone through the rehabilitation yard for the last time in the late afternoon, the sun low enough that it came through the fence slats in long stripes across the padded ground. He moved well. He paused to nose at a section of the fence he had always found interesting, a spot where a rabbit had apparently taken up residence under the far hedge. And she let him, because there was no rush now, and he had earned the right to follow his nose where it wanted to go. She had been thinking about what she was going to say to Hark for 3 days. She had considered and discarded a dozen different versions of it. She was not a person who struggled with professional conversations. She had given hard news to handlers dozens of times, had managed the entire spectrum of responses from grief to anger to denial. But this was different. She kept finding herself standing at a distance from the words, unable to close the final step. He was waiting in the intake bay when she brought Boone in from the yard. The dog saw him from across the room and went still for one moment. The old stillness, she thought, her heart dropping. And then Boone's tail lifted, slowly at first, and then faster, and he crossed the room and put his front paws on Hark's chest, and the sound that came out of Dillon Hark was not a military sound at all. It was the sound of someone who had spent a long time being afraid of a thing and had just been told they didn't have to be afraid of it anymore. She stood with her clipboard and watched the two of them and felt the familiar ache of a thing completed. The specific bittersweet quality of having been needed and now being released from that need, which was both the goal and the loss of this work every time. Hark looked up at her over the top of Boone's head. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "He's going to be okay. He's going to be okay," she confirmed. He nodded slowly, pressing one hand flat against the dog's side. "Because of you. Because of him," she said. "I just gave him the room." Hark looked at her. Then he said quietly, "I owe you something. You don't, not Boone." He set his feet back under him, straightened slightly, not the full military posture of the man who had walked in 6 weeks ago and told her to stay back, something easier. More considered, "I owe you an apology. Day one, I came in here like, I know what you came in like," she said, "and I know why still." She looked at him. "When you've spent 4 years being the only person who could handle something, it's hard to let someone else try." He was quiet. Then, "Yeah, it wasn't about me." "No," he paused. "But the way I said it to you was." She accepted that. It was a good apology, clean, without excessive ceremony, not the kind that needed her to reassure him. "Okay," she said. He reached into his jacket pocket and set a card on the intake counter. She glanced at it, a name and a number, handwritten on the back of an official-looking card. "If you need anything for the investigation, testimony, records I might have access to, whatever helps." She picked it up. She also looked at the handwriting, which she noted was careful and slightly left-tilted, and not at all what she would have expected from a man who communicated in commands. She filed that observation in the same private place she filed all the ones she didn't examine closely. 3 months later, a reporter published a long piece in a national outlet about the military working dog discharge program. Faye was quoted twice, briefly. Dr. Reyes was quoted at length. Hark was not quoted at all, which he had requested, but a source described as a decorated handler with first-hand knowledge of the system was cited 6 times, and Faye knew the cadence of those sentences. She read the piece at her kitchen table with her tea, which she managed to drink while it was still warm for once. And when she finished, she sat with it for a while. 43 military working dogs had been processed through that unit in the previous 2 years. Of the 31 they had been able to assess, 22 showed conditions that should have been caught. 19 of those conditions were treatable, if caught early. 7 dogs had already been euthanized due to conditions their handlers had been told were inevitable. She set the article down. She thought about Boone in the hydrotherapy pool that first Wednesday, moving through the water with something that looked, for the first time since he'd arrived, like the beginning of ease. She thought about what a dog body says when words aren't available. The slow tail, the lowered head, the particular quality of stillness that isn't calm. She had spent 6 years learning to read it. She would spend the rest of her career learning it better. That was the job, not the paperwork, not the complaints, not even the recoveries, though those mattered more than she could ever say. The job was the willingness to stand in an intake room in front of a man twice her size who had already decided she couldn't handle it, and to look past him at the animal, and to say, "I see what you're not able to say. I'm going to stay here until we figure it out." She picked up the article and folded it into her folder, which had grown considerably since she'd first started it at this table. She made another cup of tea. Outside, the evening was settling into the kind of quiet that comes in autumn when the light turns copper and the world slows down slightly, as if catching its breath. She sat with it for a while, the article, the folder, the tea, the quiet, and let herself feel the fullness of a thing that wasn't finished yet but was no longer invisible. Somewhere across the city, Boone was probably asleep in a patch of evening sun. He did that now, she knew, slept in the warm spots, full length, the way a dog sleeps when it isn't waiting for something bad to happen. She was glad she had taken that step forward.